So today I'll be talking about, kind of like Brian said, the future of cloud development and kind of the why and how and what of kind of editor neutrality means. So before we can talk about the future, first we should talk a little bit about kind of the timeline of editors and maybe where we are in that and kind of what got us here. So Visual Basic, going way back, was released in 1991, super heavy for .NET. Some of you might still be familiar with it. I know I used Visual Basic in like maybe 2010. Visual Studio was released in 1997. Eclipse was released in 2001. IntelliJ was released in 2001. And VS Code, much more recently, was released in 2015. So it begs the question, what's in common between these editors? And there's a few things I identified. For one, most of them are actually older than 20 years, with the exception of VS Code. And they all actually have 10% or greater of market share still to this day, which is pretty notable. And I think one thing we can pull from that is that building an editor is just really hard, and people generally don't like to switch editors. So some of these are obviously more popular than others. Some are gaining popularity, some are losing popularity. But I think the point still stands that the vast market share these editors still have, as old some of the inception points are, is pretty crazy. But there's one more editor that I actually specifically didn't mention, and that's Coder's IDE. And this isn't a product plug or anything, but the grand vision was you'd visit coder.com and we'd give you a cloud development environment that launched in under a second. It had collaboration built in, supported VS Code extensions, and it could burst to 96 cores. This was released in 2018, and based on all these crazy features, I'm certain that you've heard of it and probably were like, wow, this is the best thing ever. But for those of you that haven't, maybe let's talk about that. So why haven't you heard of it? Maybe you weren't in touch with technology, so you just didn't hear the latest news that the best editor in the world came out. Maybe it didn't fit your needs. And the real answer is actually that it no longer exists, probably in part because it didn't fit your needs. But it really failed because we lacked choice. Our workflow really didn't fit into any of the choices that devs already made. When you're a developer, you're choosing, obviously, like your settings, your extensions, everything. And even if we made that migration path really slick to our editor, we're still just doing a lot of things. So we ended up shutting it down. And what we really thought is, like, how do we provide more choice? So our first option was build a better editor, which we obviously tried and failed at. The other one is to wait for popular editors to support remote development, which you can totally do, but we wanted to help lead the movement. We didn't want to really be a straggler. And kind of the last one is to figure it out and really try to jank it together to see what you can kind of mold. And that's what we did. So some of you might be familiar with Code Server. Runs VS Code on any machine, lets you access it in the browser. This was released before VS Code, Remote SSH, or JetBrains Projector. The first version of Code Server was super hacked together. I shimmed a lot of like Electron into the web and shimmed a ton of node modules that had no business being in the web, and we released a 1.0 of it. And I think the launching version was actually somewhere around VS Code, like 1.36, I believe. And this was in about March of 2018. And it marked a really important thing because developers actually used Code Server. And this was when it launched. And prior to that, and we especially felt this with our Cloud IDE, is that people thought it was really cool. And we had a lot of people sign up to coder.com. And a lot of people were like, this is awesome. And we had people tweeting about it. But our usage numbers were horrible because we didn't actually create a tool that people wanted to use. We created something that was just really cool to try. And Code Server really marked an important point because we made something that people actually used in the remote development space. And developers for the first time really chose something remote without us having to push it onto them. We didn't really do anything to help, propel the growth of code server in a crazy way. It was kind of a natural thing. And it's of course built on top of VS Code, and VS Code is the majority of it. But an important note on it is that it's really just a small iteration on the workflow that people already love. And it doesn't try to do too many things. And one thing we look at in retrospect when we were running our cloud platform is that we were trying to boil the ocean, which I feel like is kind of a common thing in dev tools in general, which is like we were trying to host people's computers for them, and we were trying to build our own custom editor, and we were also just trying to get people to work on remote servers, which in itself has proven to be a challenge. So we were just doing a lot of things, and it really made it hard. So it kind of begs the question, what can developers choose? And this will tie back in later, but they can't choose their operating system, at least some of the time. It's not like a reliable thing. Say if you're at a company where you develop iOS apps, you just can't use a Linux machine. You can't generally pick your software stack or easily adjust it, especially in an organization. If you join a company and they've been using Java for 10 years, it's going to be a really difficult thing for you to come in and be like, let's switch everything to Go. But you can always choose your editor, your keybinds, and your terminal. This is like the common three that we've seen inside of organizations that never really changes. People can always pick Eclipse or IntelliJ or VS Code, whatever way they want to use. So now let's zoom into the future of editors a little bit, and maybe theorize over where things will be. We talked about choice a lot, which is kind of to prove that like the iteration path to going remote, you don't need to provide some crazy features. And I think Code Server really proved that. You don't need to be like, and now you can use much more resources and do all these crazy things. It was really just a slight iteration on the market that was like, use exactly what you love to use, but just in a different way. So for that reason, I theorize that you connect with your favorite editor to a remote environment. You can see on the left, it's a local environment, and on the right, it's the remote. And you can use whatever you want. And I think that's really how it will be in the future. Is you could use Code Server through the web if you want, or you can use VS Code Remote SSH if you want, or you can use Projector, or once JetBrains releases some sort of remote support, you could use that. These are just some fun like anecdotes of things that I think will happen in the future, very much so favoring towards developers. I'm going to be biased here because I write a lot of software, but these are things that I definitely dream of. Any OS to any OS, really being able to like work on Linux, but develop an iOS app for Mac. That's not really possible right now, unless maybe you have a MacBook and a Linux machine and you're local and you do some kind of crazy VNC stuff. But now a developer can suddenly choose their operating system once everything's remote. Because say like myself, I use Linux and use i3, and then I could suddenly develop an iOS app because maybe there's a Mac running in the cloud that I just connect to. And remote workspaces are getting much easier to template. I don't think this is a solved world by any means. There's a lot of like iteration on it, I'll say right now, which is like how will people actually be developing these templated workspaces in the cloud? But one future I feel like we can distinctively say is you'll be able to get faster changes to the software stack. From say if you want to move from Java 7 to Java 8, maybe you could just put a PR up for that. And now kind of what the world looks like, say after this editor neutrality is much more like, now what can you choose? You can choose your operating system. It's significantly faster to make changes to the software stack. Maybe you can't just come in and change everything you want, but you can at least much less politically change things. And you still are able to choose your editor, your keybinds, and your terminal. So to answer the original question of, will the world be editor neutral in a world of remote? I think based off this, it's fair to say yes, but hopefully it's much more empowering than just the editor itself. Hopefully we're able to hit a lot more neutrality on the operating system and the software stack that organizations are able to iterate on, and of course the editor. And that's more or less it. So if there's any questions, feel free to ask.
That was very fast, Kyle. Thank you. I'm looking now in the Slack channel to see if any questions have come in. Yeah, there's a question. Would the OS really be an OS or a hypervisor at that point?
So I guess I think, so we've actually played, I've made a hypervisor before that ran essentially like, you can think of it kind of like an OCI runtime, but for VMs as like an underlying backer. And I think that it's a little too distant right now for people to call that their everyday workflow. I think a really big thing that cloud development is trying to accomplish is merging development and production. And by trying to isolate those, which is like put developer workloads in places where production ones don't run, I think you get slightly further away from that. So I think we're more likely to trend towards a world where you develop maybe on a GCP instance because your production app runs on a GCP instance, and you use maybe a similar base image with a couple extra tools so you can have a good developer experience on it. Yeah.
Okay. I think there might be some questions coming in. There's people wanting to speak, but they haven't come in yet. What editors does Coder currently support, and what have your main challenges been in integrating? Like, are they all born equal, or is there specific challenges related to each one?
So I would say I was actually going to talk about this in this talk, but I felt it was a little bit of a tangent, so I didn't want to dive into it. But we actually have tried many more things to support a lot more editors, even stuff that's local. So say through like things like VNC, we actually compiled an X server to run in the browser with the NX protocol to get hopefully like a faster VNC. And through many of those attempts, we found that it's just better to wait for the editors to support it. So right now, we have really good support for Projector. We support VS Code Remote, and we support being able to run VS Code through the web with Code Server. And we support SSH, so any editor that would come out that can work just over SSH can work with Coder. Okay, so there's a comment here. I have used coder.com inside Uber to enable flexible web access to cloud-based Kubernetes mode. A major advantages of cloud is vertical scalability. For example, use a node with 96 cores, for instance. Have you seen anyone interested in cloud to scale builds better, for instance? I'd say we see this with there's kind of the inherent problem with like as an organization scales and as things want to move faster, very frequently the builds will just get longer because having to pay the debt of making the build faster or removing maybe some unused dependencies is not always the largest priority at the time. So I'd say we've seen that as a very common thread, especially in large apps, which is like, yeah, this takes 40 minutes to compile on my, even if it's like an M1 Mac, and it takes 5 minutes on a 96 core machine with heavy parallelism. So yeah, we've definitely seen that as like a target market.
Okay. Another question, at a high level, are you talking about converting more editors to run in the cloud, or about making editors running locally better at remote development?
So we actually, so it's kind of a funny question because we used to, I guess, have the philosophy that we try to convert or try to jank a lot of these editors into working for the cloud. And we've kind of taken an alternative approach now, which is we really want people to, we have preference for the editors to provide great support because we want to be a neutral company that can consume whatever developer workflow or whatever operating system a person wants to bring. So to answer the question more directly, we're much more about making the editors run locally at a remote development environment, or if something's natively supported, say like through the browser, kind of like the code server brings to VS Code Web, we'll run that and very happily. Yeah, we try to keep stuff as native as possible, I guess I would say, to remove as much jank as we can.
Right. Yeah, and I've noticed that trend a lot as well. You notice as well, it goes back to your point earlier about not trying to boil the ocean, right? It's finding developers where they are, and supporting their workflows,
Exactly.
and fitting in your tools. Yeah. I definitely see that as a pattern. Whereas, maybe 2-3 years ago, it was more about let's get everything working in the cloud, in browser, and get all developers there, right? Which is,
yeah. It's just
it'll take time.
It's a lot of things to do, because like doing a remote development environment in general is really, really hard. And I don't think anyone's fully cracked the code yet. But doing that and trying to make all the editors work with a remote development environment is just doing a lot of things.
Right. Yeah, I think that the more, let's say, the more cloud-based approach, it works in specific use cases. Maybe there's, for example, enterprise use cases where you can particularly control workspaces and environments and get your clients set up and so on. But for kind of broader use, yeah, it doesn't work.
For sure.
Okay, I think that's it for questions right now. Kyle, I would encourage you to head into the Cloud IDE Day Editor Neutral channel on Slack, and I'm sure there'll be conversation there afterwards. People might have more questions for you.
Awesome.
Yeah, so thank you once again. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.